Expert is generous, but thank you. I will say that, so bear with me. This is my first time for the year doing this, so I might be a little bit rusty. But going through, and really what I want to talk about is kind of what you can do now and give you some background, a little bit of information about what it is, like I said, you can do now, what it means when we say stuff, and hopefully give you some nomenclature throughout the process, but also really what all of the kinds of aid and all that good stuff and what it means and how you get it and what you need to do and things to look out for. So as I go through this process, I'll say, as you can see, we are all back in the office now. Everybody's back. It used to be a lot more fun. I could do these from home, but here now, I'm going to throw my presentation here up behind me. See if I can make sure you get it right. There we go. All right. So we're in there. The thing that I always kind of start with here, what is financial aid? And the reality is most folks don't put it all together, with the misconception being that financial aid is just grants and scholarships. But the reality is anything that you have available to you to help you pay for higher education expenses, and they come from all these different sources. And so currently the federal government is the largest source of aid here in the US. Maryland has done a lot of great things in terms of their additions to programs, the addition of funding for existing programs for students. For instance, one great program they have is the Guaranteed Access Grant for low-income students. Last year was $19,300. This year it's a max of $20,000. So you see that significant increase year over year for the last few years for that program. And then college universities and the grants and scholarships and programs that they have, as well as any private sources that you go out and apply for, if it's loans or if it's scholarships or grant programs. And then surprisingly, employers may have tuition benefits as well. Those tuition benefits may come in the way of tuition matching, kind of dollar for dollar, whatever the case may be. Any HR benefits to help you pay for college, any savings plans you may be able to get into as well. And so really just looking and speaking with your HR office to see what they have available for you to help you through paying for the education. So really, kind of starting from the beginning, how do I apply for financial aid? Something you can do right now for those of you who have or are rising seniors, you can go in and start this process right now. Just be sure that you do keep a hold of the information and keep it somewhere very safe, because as you can see there in green, you will use it for subsequent years. It will be something that you'll come back to time and time again to log into the federal student aid website, which is there, studentaid.gov. What this FSA ID is your login and your access, but also for the free application for federal student aid that we'll touch on. It is your legal signature for that, as well as any master promissory notes or insurance counselings that you have to do. You're going to be using this. So it's really important to be sure you keep this, like I said, in a safe place and have access to it when you do need it. Right now, I will say, if you've ever seen this before from me, and the council I know have seen this, there is a piece missing from here. The Department of Ed has actually, they haven't taken it down, but they are slowly removing the federal student aid app for your device. They found that nobody used it, so there's not going to be an option anymore. But the FAFSA on the web, the paper FAFSA is still available. You can still print it out, fill it in by hand, sign it, and mail it. That takes a while. Definitely wouldn't recommend that. FAFSA on the phone. And FAA, that's Financial Aid Administrator, we have access to be able to do that for you. But in reality, we will walk you through the steps to have you do it yourself. That way you can get in, you can fill it out, sign it, and we can be on our way. And we'll get it. Typically, once it's submitted, schools that are listed on the FAFSA will get it within about 48 hours. To be able to start using that information that we'll talk about here in just a minute. And if any questions do pop up, as mentioned, throw them in the chat there. I'll try to keep up with them as best I can, but if not, I'll certainly come back to them at the end. So as I mentioned, the free application federal student aid, or the FAFSA, as you may have heard it, will open, for those of you who are rising seniors, will open October 1st for you for next year. And so the fall 2023 start academic year you'll be able to file the FAFSA this coming fall for that academic year. It is required for all federal aid, if it's the loan programs, the grant programs, work study, those kinds of things. You have to have this on file to be eligible for those. And it is standard. It's going to ask the same questions of everyone. You don't necessarily have to answer all of the questions. It does have that skip logic built in to make things a little bit easier for you and for you to be able to hopefully get through a little bit quicker. But the idea being that it asks the same questions of everyone, demographic, financial information for the student and the family. And the key is it is a financial picture of the entire family. So one of the questions that we get a lot is, okay, I'm filling out this form. My parents are divorced, or I'm the parent, and I've divorced from my son or daughter's other parent. Who goes on the FAFSA? The reality is it's whoever the student spends the most time with throughout the academic year and supports that student 51% of the year. This also includes if that parent is remarried, the step parent will be included as well. It is a full household picture. And so all of that information does need to go in there. So this is something, those of you who are rising seniors, you're going to be able to get to do both FAFSAs. The FAFSA Simplification Act that was signed at the end of last year, or 2 years ago, 2021. Wow. The Simplification Act was actually pushed out a year for us. And so you can see there, it's not until the 24-25 academic year, but October 2023 is when the FAFSA simplification will go into effect. It's reduced down from 110 to 15 questions to 36. And so it's going to be obviously much quicker for students to file. It's going to should be much easier for students to file and get through. And then going to something called the Student Aid Index. And this is going to be, I think, easier for families to understand. It should allow us to offer more students things like Pell Grants, need funding, those kinds of things. So hopefully it will make the institutions in college more affordable and easier to afford for most students moving forward. But with that change in the FAFSA, you'll hear a lot more from all of us about that over the next year or so. Some institutions do require what's called the CSS profile. The CSS profile is the College Board institutional reporting form for finances. It is used to determine institutional aid, and typically institutional aid only. It will be in addition to the FAFSA. So like I mentioned, to be a part of any of those federal loan programs, the federal Pell Grant, you have to have the FAFSA on file. On the other hand, if they have any institutional grant money or perhaps scholarships, private institutions can require a student to submit the CSS profile in addition to the FAFSA. You will have to submit this to the individual institutions. The kicker here is they did change it, but if you're a household of over, I think it was $100,000 or $75,000, I have to look at the exact amount. They do offer a waiver to submit this. If you're over that threshold, it does cost you something to submit to the individual institutions. But there are only about, excuse me, 400 schools in the country, only 3 here in Maryland that take the CSS profile. They're all private institutions. The great question just popped in about paying the money back. So any scholarships or grants, those kinds of things, those do not need to be paid back. The only thing that would be paid back would be student loans. The other kind of self-help we'll talk about a little bit here, as well as work study, and you would actually earn that money through a job to help pay for some of your educational expenses. So, all right, you have the FAFSA form, you have the CSS profile. What are we doing with all that information? How are we going to use it? How are we going to move forward? And really, the expected family contribution, that is what it's called right now. As I mentioned, in the future, it's going to be called the Student Aid Index. But this is your number. And so it's calculated through that FAFSA form. It stays the same regardless of the college you attend. And it's a really important point that we're going to touch on again. And it's what currently the feds think that you can be reasonably expected to pay per year of education. Again, this does not mean that you have to pay that amount of money, but it's a determinant of eligibility for a lot of programs, as well as what they think you could put towards the education in a given year. These are the big things right now. tax information, business farm income, investment number and household number in college, untaxed income, that have a major impact on the EFC calculation. Those are things that they assume that will be used for educational expenses. And so as you go through and fill this out, you can get a pretty good idea of how all this kind of fits together. Every institution has a cost, right? So everyone knows about direct costs, tuition, fees, housing, meals. But a lot of folks don't really think about the indirect costs that are associated with that as well, associated with the education, books, transportation, personal expenses, loan fees. All this is put in for us in terms of what we call the full cost of attendance, because we know that yes, you have a bill to pay for tuition fees, housing, and meals, but you also have other expenses that you have to pay for as well. Those books, some of them are not cheap. You can rent them, which helps with the cost of those textbooks, but those are going to be a cost every semester you're enrolled or every term that you're enrolled throughout your educational career. And so all this comes, as I mentioned, the full cost of attendance. And this is really important because the cost of attendance allows you to finance some of those costs like books without having to pay out of pocket immediately. But this also comes into play here. So I mentioned the expected family contribution, that EFC is yours. So you have each individual institution's cost of attendance. You have your family contribution. This determines your financial need, demonstrated financial need for that academic year. This is a calculation. This is not, I need money for college. This is something that we have. And that financial need, along with that EFC, determines eligibility for almost all of the programs that we have. So the student has financial need, they're going to be eligible for these need-based aid programs. If they do not have any financial need, then they're eligible for just those non-need-based aid programs. So these two categories are determined by the cost of attendance at an institution, as well as the student's EFC in that calculation that we just saw. And getting into, everyone wants gift aid, obviously, grants, scholarships, kind of to the previous question that popped up. These are things that you earn through one way or another. Scholarships typically through your achievement, academics, arts, perhaps athletics, and grants are based off of your student financial need to help cover some of that cost moving forward. The other kind of self-help portions, the loans that, again, you would have to pay back, those loan programs, but also that money that you would earn while working at a job on campus, the work-study program. And so with that, I'm going to stop there for just a second. Are there any questions about anything we've covered so far? All right, those things they pop up, we'll address them. So where does all this money come from? We touched on it very briefly with that circle at the beginning, but really getting into kind of where the funding comes from, how you get it, what you need to do. This institutional funding, scholarships and grants, as I mentioned, are kind of the main source of the institutional funding. There are some programs, for instance, if a student is a residence hall coordinator, or if they're a residence hall and work for Res Life, I forget the name of it, but they have different names at different institutions. They can receive waivers from an institution to cover the difference of a cost between a single and a double room, or if they're a coordinator, kind of a higher up position, they can get waivers to cover the entire cost of their housing while they're on campus. So there are different pieces that can go into assisting in covering that cost, but typically these are the two that you're going to see. And scholarship, as I mentioned, are based on your student achievement, regardless of the financial need of the student. But it's really important to understand and start keeping track right now of those schools you have on your long list, or even your short list if you've gotten that far, that the scholarship application deadline may be different. And if it is different, typically earlier than the application for admission. So it's really important to have note of when those deadlines are to be sure you have your applications in for scholarship and admission on time. The grants, as I mentioned, those are need-based funds to allow the colleges to assist you in covering those educational expenses, that cost of attendance, as best they can to make that education as affordable as possible. I mentioned state funding, the guaranteed access grant that I covered at the very beginning, just talking about some of those programs. There are a lot of other state programs here in Maryland. There are income-based programs, so low-income students. There are job-based programs. So if you're going to a particular field, you can receive funding for that, like the teacher. Uh, Again, I forgot the exact name of it. There's a teacher grant that the state has that if you're in an undergrad program that leads to a certificate in education, or even a master's program that leads to a certificate to teach, you can earn up to 100% of your tuition for that program. There are other kind of family-based programs for students if they had family members serve in Iraq or Afghanistan, if they're currently serving in other positions. And so really taking a look at everything that's out there for the Maryland State programs. And one that we always recommend to students and families at the bottom there, you see those legislative scholarships. MDelect.net will tell you exactly who your senators and delegates are for the state of Maryland based off of your home address. Every one of them has funds to award to students. And so it's really important to reach out to those folks to see if you can apply, how you apply, and if you can be eligible to receive those as well. And then we mentioned private scholarships, outside money. This is going to be up to you, the student. There's not a whole lot that we can do to assist you with this. We certainly do have some resources on our website. Montgomery County Public Schools has a great resource for scholarship search. The ability for you to go out and apply for these, and some students have made it a summer job and have applied to 50, 60, 70 scholarships. You apply to a few, you apply to a lot. Every dollar helps. And so really working to get those applications in can be an important part of this this whole paying for college process as well. And then a quick touch, we mentioned loans, student loans. I have more information if you've ever seen me do this in the fall during the school year. I go into a little more depth about the student loan process, but very quickly, kind of the different two programs, the Stafford loan program, those are the federal lending programs. Every student who files a FAFSA is eligible to receive those loans. The Parent Plus loan you see there at the bottom, that is an additional application for the loan itself that parents will have to fill out. One parent will have to submit. All of these federal loan programs should be your first look. We always recommend that the federal Stafford loan program be the first financing choice. And then if need be, move on to the private source loans. In almost every case, the terms, the rates for the Stafford loan program will be better than the private loans coming from a bank or credit union or educational lender. Just always kind of take those Stafford loans in your first look. And you'll see those two different types of loans there under the student loans. The subsidized loan just means that while a student is enrolled in school, that interest is subsidized by the Department of Ed on your behalf until you finish. The unsubsidized loan is not subsidized in terms of interest. The interest will accrue on that loan while you're in school, but for both of those, nothing is due in terms of payment until 6 months after you're finished with school. So again, those kind of terms and things like that that go along with those loans can be incredibly helpful for students and families. Right, so we did have a question come in. What degree does the FAFSA take into account savings as expected contributing factor? So cash on hand, either in checking or savings account, is a question on the FAFSA. It can have an impact because both the student and the parent information will go in there. So like we just recently saw a student who worked a couple of years ago, and the kind of student contribution to that whole EFC was about $800. They earned somewhere around $4,000 for the year. So there is a more significant weight put on student income than there is parent income, with the thought process being that a student earning funding should probably use more of that to pay for the education than a parent who has an entire household to keep, perhaps with more people than just the one. And so I can't give you an exact percentage. There are a lot of different factors that go into how that EFC is calculated, but it is a factor within that process and that calculation. So there are things, obviously, the FAFSA form with its numbers, they just can't take into account. So the feds have given us this opportunity to go through what's called a special circumstances or professional judgment review on behalf of the student and the family. The idea being that you say to us, so this has happened, say it's loss of income, a parent had to change jobs and they are making less than they were a year or 2 years ago. With some documentation and a written request from student or family, we can take that kind of information into account with the documentation we have on hand to make adjustments to the FAFSA form itself. And so we obviously, with the pandemic of the last couple of years, we've seen a lot more of those with loss of income and things like that, that we're able to reduce the expected family contribution of the student to offer more and maybe even a lot more in gift aid. So that grant and scholarship money from the feds, the state, the institution, to cover some of that educational cost. So it's really important to reach out to those financial aid administrators at the schools that you'd like to attend, that you're applying to or you've been admitted to see if there's anything that can be done in regards to this, if there is a circumstance that has changed from the FAFSA information. So as I mentioned, all these different kind of things can be taken into account. These are not the only things that can be taken into account, but it will be up to the institution as how they handle that process. And so here at St. Mary's, we do have early decision, early action, and regular decision. We package every student shortly after they're admitted. Some institutions will wait and release a decision to everyone at the same time. So for instance, if a student applies early action here at St. Mary's, they will hear from us before the holiday break what their financial package is. The application decisions go out, and within about a week to 2 weeks, our financial aid decisions will go out as well. A school like College Park, they wait until about February or March, maybe even a little bit later, depending on their class, and release. It's a massive release to everyone what their financial aid packages are. The key to that is everyone has until May 1st, except for the early decision folks. Everyone else has until May 1st to make that decision. And so when they finally make their decision, pay the deposit, know where they're going to go, they have all the information at hand to be able to make that best financial decision for them. And of course, we're going to do our very best to include everything we know that you're eligible to receive: scholarships, grants, federal programs, state programs. We can make an assumption on the state programs based off your information, what you're going to be eligible to receive, and then institutional scholarships and grants, and of course, those federal loan options that come out to the students with that FAFSA on hand. And so really, you should have everything there to be able to make that decision, the best decision for you moving forward. The tools and things that you can use that are out there, this is just a very small sample of those things that are there to help you understand the process. The Federal Student Aid website that I mentioned at the beginning does have some great information in terms of checklists, timelines, things you should be thinking about, explanations of what things are, and help throughout the entire process, along with the Federal Student Aid Estimator. So this is going to give you an idea of what you can expect for federal aid, state aid, perhaps, what your EFC will look like. The college cost worksheet will allow you to determine your demonstrated financial need, maybe even scholarships that you'd be eligible to receive, what the cost would be after that. And then every institution who participates in the federal programs, that's called Title IV, that accepts the FAFSA, is required by law to have a net price calculator on their website. So this will give you a net price for that institution based off your information. So it should give you a pretty good idea of what it's going to cost you individually to attend that school, that college, university. So great question. The financial aid application, does it satisfy requirements for all schools, or do you have to apply for financial aid separately for each school? The FAFSA and the CSS profile both allow you to include up to 10 institutions at a time. So if a student is applying to more than 10, what they'll do is I put the first 10 in, submit the application, wait 24 hours, go back in to make it as if they were making a correction, take 2 schools out, put the other 2 schools in, and submit it again. And so those other 2 schools have that information as well. So it's gone to all 12 schools. They'll be able to have that information, and so it should make it pretty easy to be able to apply to as many schools. Typically, most folks can get away with a single submission with those 10 allocations that are included there. And the last piece that I really kind of want to touch on before we get into questions and things like that, if there are any other questions, is really truly understanding what the cost of the education is. The net price calculator is supposed to help you through this, but really getting an idea of being able to compare apples to apples is really important. The cost, which is the tuition and fees, the room and board that we talked about, what they're going to charge you for the education is going to differ from school to school. So the gift aid they will award to you is probably going to differ as well. So the net cost is going to be kind of a determining factor. What you're going to have to cover somehow. If it's loans and financing, if it's payment plans, if it's an outright payment to the account, 529s, savings, whatever it is, that's what's going to have to be paid for somehow. And so the idea being that, excuse me, at a school like St. Mary's, where the tuition, fees, housing, meals, those kinds of things add up to about $29,000. At a northern private that I won't mention by name, their direct costs are somewhere around $62,000. So they're more than double what we are. Now, the key to that is if we offer a student a $6,000 scholarship, that brings it down to around 23, not including any other grant aid they may be eligible to receive. So the net cost of that student right now is $23,000. At that no-name private up north, they may award a scholarship of $30,000, which is fantastic. You've earned it. You should be proud of yourself. But the reality is that net cost is still $30,000. And so it's still $7,000 more expensive than a place like St. Mary's. And so having an understanding of that net price is going to be really, really important when you're making that decision. And the value is a little bit different. Value is subjective. It's away from net cost. That's a calculation that is a hard number. But the reality is a value is, what are you getting out of the education? What's your return on investment? What have you gained through your educational experience, the program that you have? And so it really does put into kind of perspective that an institution may be a little bit more, it may be a little bit less, but is it a place that has what you want to learn and what you want to do in the future? Is it a place that you're going to be comfortable and you're going to thrive and you're going to grow in both your education and your personal life? Those kinds of things should be taken into account as well. If a student is unhappy where they are, this is kind of my admissions hat. If a student is unhappy where they are, they're not going to thrive. They're not going to want to go to class. They're not going to do well in their educational activities. Probably not going to be involved in extracurricular activities. And so really finding that place and getting out of the education what you truly came to hire it for is going to be really, really important for that process. So with that being said, are there any other questions, concerns, anything else that we can answer for you this morning?
I got nothing.
Yes, Kate, thank you. The MISPA, the Maryland State Financial Aid Application. Any student who is undocumented or DACA that is ineligible, that is a Maryland resident that is ineligible to file the FAFSA for that exact reason. A couple of years ago, Maryland decided to create their own application. So the Maryland State Financial Aid Application allows students to apply for the Maryland state programs, specifically the Guaranteed Access Grant and the EA Rawlings Grant. That the Guaranteed Access Grant for this year is $20,000 for those students that qualify, and the EA Rawlings is $3,000. Those two programs, obviously, a huge benefit to students that can't apply for the FAFSA form. That can be in addition to institutional scholarships. So you don't have to have a FAFSA on file, as I mentioned, in most places to receive those institutional scholarships. But their Maryland State Financial Aid Application can open those doors up for those students that are not eligible to file the FAFSA and receive the other benefits like the Pell Grant or work study or even loan programs. Great question. So why do private colleges ask for so much additional financial aid information? Most private schools, I won't say most, a lot of the private schools go through a process that's called the institutional methodology. And so they use that additional information to come up with their own demonstrated financial need calculation. And so that means they're taking into account, for instance, home value, the property that you may have. With, one can make the leap or the assumption that you should use the equity in your home for college expenses. Those kinds of things are how those institutional methodologies are created. Yeah, so thanks, Kate. The appeal of financial aid decision, you can, I mentioned the special circumstances. If there's something documented that we can look at, we can determine and make a change. The other side is just kind of a feeling saying, hey, nothing's changed, but I do need additional aid. Every school that I know of will take an appeal, and nothing may come of it. On the other hand, something may come of it. And so it really comes to the institutional decision. It never hurts to ask. You can say, hey, I think I deserve more scholarship because my senior year GPA went up by a whole point. Or if a school and you submit your test scores, you take them again and say, my test scores went up by 50 points or whatever the case may be. You can always make an argument. It's if the institution will take the argument and adjust your package or not. That will be up to the individual institution. But again, it never hurts to ask. That can certainly be a factor. So is it advisable to inform one school of a better financial offer from another school? We actually ask for those students that appeal. Can you send us the other offers that you've received? Because we want to be sure, coming back to that slide about net cost, that the student A understands, and hopefully we can explain to them that yes, again, that school gave you $30,000 scholarship. That's wonderful, but we are still significantly less expensive off the bat. And so being sure they understand that part. And then, if it is comparable, we can say, you know what, you're right. We'll give you an extra $500. That puts us below that other institution. Hopefully, we're your best choice. We understand, we talk about fit and educational programs. Those are incredibly important to the decision process, but we also understand that finances are also an incredibly important part of that decision process. So we do want to be sure you have, the best that we possibly can.
Looks like you've covered things pretty well.
All right.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm going to stop the recording, but I just wanted to let you know that